Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to First Families, Birth Parents Journeying Together. This is brought to you by NAAP, the National Association of Adoptees and Parents, where it is our mission to unify the adoption community and elevate our diverse voices by promoting dialogue, understanding, and healing through education, awareness, and connection. I am your host, Amber Jimerson. If you're new here and to NAAP, I encourage you to follow us on social media, the National Association of Adoptees and Parents on Facebook, or our Instagram here at First Families Support. If you're not familiar, First Families is a peer facilitated support group. We meet on second Thursdays, but we also offer special guest speaking events such as these every few months, which are open to everyone. So I am so excited to see so many of you coming out here. I know we're all super excited to hear Gretchen. Before we begin, I do have one big announcement. We have an event coming up soon. Some of you know the Untangling Our Roots Summit. That's April 25th through 28th in Denver, Colorado. This is our incredible summit, and it's a collaboration between NAAP and Right to Know. And it is there's Jen, the only conference for the combined adoption, assisted reproduction, NPE, and DNA surprise communities. So please head over to untanglingourroots.org for more details and to snag your tickets. I really highly encourage you to attend this summit if you can, because the next one won't be until spring 2026. So, okay, let's get down to business. It's been a minute since we've had a guest speaker, and tonight we are welcoming Dr. Gretchen Sisson, who will be discussing her new book, Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. Gretchen's research draws on a 10-year study examining how relinquishing mothers make decisions about their pregnancies and parenting plans and how they feel about their adoptions over time. More broadly, though, her work considers the social contexts in which their individual decisions are made and how politics, religion, race, poverty, and inequality shape our understandings of adoption and who it serves. Gretchen is a qualitative sociologist studying abortion and adoption at Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at the University of California at San Francisco. Her research was cited in the Supreme Court's dissent in Dobbs v. Jackson, Women's Health Organization, and has been covered in the Washington Post, The Nation, All Things Considered, Considered This, New York Magazine, Vox, and other outlets. So her book was just released at the end of February, and I'm so very thrilled to welcome Gretchen tonight. I did have the pleasure of finishing her book recently, and I just cannot overstate how important this work is. I'm incredibly humbled and grateful for your interest and motivation to dig deep in a topic, even though you're not actually a part of the adoption constellation. And I think because of this research, I have high hopes for your ability to deliver this information into the political and academic and mainstream settings that I think those of us affected by adoption loss often find difficult to penetrate. So thank you for joining us. And please, everyone, let's show our excitement by muting ourselves and letting Gretchen take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, Amber, for that very, very generous and kind introduction. And thank you, Amy, for your help bringing us together today. I see a lot of familiar names and some familiar faces, so I'm really excited to be in community with all of you. Thanks for having me. So as Amber said, I am Gretchen Sisson. I've been studying adoption since about 2010. And I think the first question a lot of folks, particularly a lot of first mothers, ask is, well, why are you impacted by this? What brings you to this work? And the answer is, no, I'm not an adoptee. I'm not a birth mother. As Amber mentioned, I don't have a direct personal connection to adoption. I have a cousin who's adopted. Everybody has a cousin who's adopted. Everybody, and if you go out far enough, there's always a degree of connection. But that's not what drove my work in this space. I came to this work from my time when I was in graduate school, working with an organization called the Alliance on Teen Pregnancy, that did a lot of work with young moms and pregnant and parenting teen moms, working on the pregnant parenting student policy at the Boston Public Schools, and then doing a lot of lobbying to ensure that young parents had access to the childcare, the housing, the resources that they needed to take care of themselves and their children. And it was sort of from this space that I started looking at the ways that their own motherhood was really stigmatized and marginalized, and the way that adoption was consistently framed as sort of a response to everyone that we judge for parenting in this country. And that was the summer that 16 and Pregnant started airing on TV, and this sort of recurring cultural narrative came out that the couple on that first season, Caitlin and Tyler, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with their story, the arc was that they were a better parent, right, for relinquishing their daughter, that made them more selfless, more mature, more loving. And I'm looking at these incredible young women that I'm working with at the Alliance, and just seeing this gap between the cultural conversation around what parenthood should be and look like, and really the lived reality of their lives. And that was something that I wanted to explore more deeply. So I started interviewing relinquishing mothers in 2010. That was, at that time, I didn't have sort of an age or a year brackets on the research that I was doing. So I spoke with mothers from the baby scoop era up through 2009, adoptions up to 2009. So within a year of when I started doing the data collection. And that was, I published a couple papers out of that as my dissertation work. But what I found in some of those early interviews was that some of the mothers in more recent adoptions, so adoptions that were within the last 2 to 5 years, felt much more positively about their adoptions, right? They had a lot of optimism about what the adoption was going to mean for them, for their child, and just, were enthusiastic about the adoptions. And the question for me as a researcher at the time was, do they feel better about their adoptions because adoption has actually gotten better? Like, are we, are there actually better practices around this that are protecting people, reducing harm, leading to like worthy of this optimism that they're expressing? Or does everyone come to a more critical place over time? What does that look like? And so I was like, well, maybe I'll go back and interview them later. And then that is what I did. So I went back, and in 2020, I re-interviewed all of the women that I had interviewed in 2010 who had relinquished between 2000 and 2010. So that cohort for the first 10 years of 2000 to 2010. I interviewed them a second time 10 years later. And then I did an additional cohort recruitment of women who had relinquished between 2010 and 2020. And what I found is not going to be a massive surprise to any of you on this call, but almost everyone came to a far more critical understanding of their own adoption 10 years later. A few of them were still in an okay place, and we can talk about them a little bit later, but almost all of them were much more critical, much more cynical, and much more, just that optimism that they had when I first spoke with them didn't endure. So I was gonna read just a little bit. Is that okay, Amber, if I just read a few pages? Because I think it kind of helps frame. So I open with this story about a young woman named Haley. Haley was 19. She was facing her second pregnancy. She'd had her first child when she was 15, and she was parenting that child. She had had a lot of support from her own parents in parenting her first son. So she's pregnant with her second baby at age 19, and this time around, her parents were deeply not supportive. And there were a couple of reasons for that she proposed. And then like, an hour into our interview, she's like, maybe it's because his father's Black. And I was like, oh yeah, maybe part of it. Right. So these things sort of like come out over time. I think there was certainly some racism that was driving that decision, but there was a lot that was going on. And so Haley found that without her parents' support, she did not have a way to raise that second child. So just going to read a few pages. This is reflecting on her first interview. When I first spoke with Haley, it was just over a year since her second son, Elijah, was born. She had initially wanted a semi-open adoption, which for her meant exchanging pictures and updates and having occasional visits. But the agency she worked with gave her a profile for prospective adoptive parents, Rachel and Mark, and Haley was immediately drawn to them. Rachel and Mark wanted a fully open adoption, having learned that research supported the idea that openness was better for the adopted child. Haley agreed. I couldn't handle not ever hearing from Rachel and Mark again. It wasn't just because of Elijah, it was because of them. I just really love them. I couldn't really imagine not having them be part of my life. Rachel is practically a sister to me now. I definitely consider them part of my family. I think they consider me part of theirs. I talk to Rachel pretty much every day, and it's not always about Elijah. I think she cares about me too. Haley seemed satisfied with where she was in life. She felt that the adoption helped her gain the respect of her parents, which she had never really had. When we spoke, she'd just become a certified nursing assistant and was about to begin a job that paid $11 an hour, more money than she'd ever made. She couldn't yet hold Elijah without crying, but she loved that Rachel never put him down. I couldn't do that if I'd kept him, she said. I'd have to be working, and most likely it would have to be 2 jobs, and then I wouldn't have time to not put him down. Haley was excited that Rachel, Mark, and Elijah had moved closer to where she lived, just an hour away, and was hopeful that she'd see them more often. In many ways, this is a successful adoption narrative, and Haley's story seemed to confirm our best ideas about what adoption today could be. Rachel and Mark cared about Haley, and they were so committed to open adoption that they pushed for it when Haley was initially reluctant. Haley, the young woman who was so alone during her pregnancy, felt the support and friendship of her son's adoptive mother. Elijah was loved and healthy in a stable family. Haley felt respected by her parents, had achieved an educational goal, and was eagerly on a path toward financial self-sufficiency. If Haley's feelings about her own adoption were unexplored, if it seemed that Haley needed Rachel's friendship in an asymmetrical way, if Haley's inability to hold Elijah without crying was mentioned just passingly, and if there was an implied question mark lingering in Haley's voice when she talked about being part of Rachel and Mark's family, surely the foundation was strong enough to weather all that for a lifetime. It would take 10 years and hundreds of interviews with women like Haley for me to understand why it wasn't. And I think that this is sort of the contrast between what we see, right? Haley was still in a really vulnerable place. When I spoke with her, it was still really early in the adoption. Her son was still a baby. But she had what she understood to be this close relationship with his adoptive parents. It was clear to me that she was really dependent on them in a lot of ways, not financially, not for support, but that she looked up to them. She sort of had this infatuation with them that actually a lot of mothers conveyed, feeling really almost starstruck by their parents. Cassie, another mother who I interviewed, she talked about like how she was making a $9 an hour at her job. And her son's adoptive parents were like a fashion designer and like a news broadcaster, and they just seemed like such celebrities to her, right? And it doesn't even need to be that level, but just women who feel very alone where they are in their pregnancy, who don't have their family support, who don't have a stable income or even a living wage, who are struggling with their own educational aspirations and what they want their family to look like. It doesn't take much to get them there, right? So families, in their prospective parent profiles will share things like, here's our gorgeous home and our big backyard, and here's where we walk to the farmer's market, and here's our, excellent public schools, and here are our parents who can't wait to be grandparents, our other kids who can't wait to be big brothers or big sisters. And it really speaks directly to a lot of the things that mothers feel like they are missing in their own lives that are leading them to interact with the adoption system in the first place. And so I think that Haley was really a key example of that, where she felt very obligated to Rachel and Mark to give them a child. And then she was really reliant on that relationship with them. And of course, this was not going to last, right? Of course, they didn't have the support, they didn't have the understanding of each other that was going to enable this to be a successful relationship long term. And so I think that was what I needed to understand, was how these things would actually bear out over time. What I found was that without a lot of supports, obviously things fall apart. And I think that what we need to understand is so much of how everything that happens during the pregnancy or right after delivery, there's nothing that is designed to provide the sort of lifelong support that you need to make openness work over time. And I always say, like, you can put like some harm reductive practices in place. You can sort of give some infrastructure to that type of relationship. But much the same way as there's no guarantee that there's no system that would guarantee that everybody's always going to get along with all of their in-laws, right? There's no guarantee that these relationships are going to stay. And they, of course, change over time, right? People move, children grow up, their needs change. And so even in the best of circumstances, there were challenges in figuring out how this is going to play out. The two top reasons that mothers came to a much more critical place of their adoptions were, one, they almost all had less contact with their child than they wanted and that they believed that they were going to get. So for some of them, that meant that they had been completely cut off from their child. Many of them didn't realize that the openness agreements that they had set up at the time of their pregnancy or right after birth were not legally binding. And, some of them were happy with the amount of contact that they had. Most of them wanted more. I think only like 2% of birth mothers report wanting less contact with their child. And so they weren't happy with that contact that they were getting. And there's one story that I relate, mother that I call Kristen. She had an open adoption. What that meant in the context of what their agency had coached them on and led them to agree on was that they were going to get one in-person visit per year. And they had that one in-person visit, but her son's adoptive parents had never told her son who she was. So he just thought that this was a friend of his mom's that they saw once a year. And at the time of our first interview, she was parenting, I think her son was about 8. She was parenting a 3-year-old. She was pregnant again. And she would bring her daughter to these visits with her son, who of course didn't know that he was her son. And she was talking about how the visits were really painful for her. They were really hard, especially because he didn't know who she was. And she said, I'm going through this pain because I believe it's good for him to know who I am. But if he doesn't actually know who I am, then he's not getting the benefit of this openness and this relationship that I'm trying to give him. And she also said, my 3-year-old knows who he is. She knows that this is her brother. She knows that he grew in my belly. Like, that was the way that she had talked to her daughter about it. She's going to spill the beans. If I bring her with me, she's going to say something. And so she had, at the time that I talked with her, she was like, I'm thinking about maybe not going to this year's visit. Right. And when I spoke with her again 10 years later, she had not seen him in many, many years, and hadn't had a lot of contact. And I tell that story because I think that this is an important one, because a lot of times you'll hear from adoptive parents like, oh, well, like our child's mother doesn't want to have an open relationship, right? And I think for a lot of the women I interviewed, openness was very, very emotionally hard. And they did it because they believed that it would be good for their child. But if they did not feel like it was giving a benefit to their child, they would often pull back. And I think that is that's important to understand, the ways that some of them needed to kind of emotionally regulate by controlling the contact that they, not because they didn't want to have contact with their child, but because they didn't have a way of having that relationship that was helpful, emotionally fulfilling to them and also to their child. So I think that that was a really important component of openness as well. So unhappiness with the ongoing relationship and the amount of contact, that was kind of the first reason that a lot of mothers came to a more critical place in understanding their adoptions. The second reason is feeling that the adoption had not given their child what they had been told adoption would give their child. So for some of them, this was like almost like a logistical thing, right? Like a lot of mothers relinquished because they believed that their child needed to have a 2-parent family, right? A lot of these mothers came from more conservative spaces, evangelical communities where there was still a really high stigma attached to single motherhood. And they believed my child deserves 2 parents. This is what I have to give them. This is the way that I'm going to give that to them, and they put. And a couple mothers were like, well, within 3 years, I was married, I was raising a child with my partner, and the adoptive parents are divorced, right? That happened a couple of times. Things like that, where it's like, oh, this is the very specific reason why I believed I was not going to be a worthy parent for my child, why I was told I was not going to be a worthy parent for my child. And that is still what they have in the context of the adoption. The other way that they saw adoption as serving their child poorly was just that they didn't have any education around adoption trauma, around what adopted people needed and what that would mean for them. They were never counseled on that. That was never part of how they were educated about adoption during their pregnancy. This was particularly true for mothers whose children were in transracial adoption. And I think that white mothers of biracial children were particularly oblivious to what their child's needs as a transracial adoptee would be. And they saw their child growing up in white households, white communities, being the only child of color. This is true for white mothers of biracial children and also mothers of color, certainly. People who didn't have a connection to their own, people who looked like them. And that also brought them to a really critical place. So it happened. These were kind of the 2 umbrella reasons why people came to feel somewhat negatively about their adoptions. And I think that neither one of them are things that it's clear the system could fix, right? These are sort of fundamental to how we understand adoption, and it shows whose needs are continually being prioritized throughout the process. And of course, it's the adoptive parents, right? It's so infrequently about the child, which it claims to be about, and it's even less frequently about how mothers are understanding what adoption is going to give their child, if they have any agency in understanding that at all, if how they feel about it matters at all from the start. I was going to read another little bit to talk about this because, there is certainly coercion that still happens. There is, I don't need to tell all of you what these coercive adoptions look like, but there is also a lot of gray area now in how vulnerable pregnant people are really targeted for adoption, and how agencies are motivated to meet the demand for babies that aren't outright coercion, but I think still speak to these vulnerabilities. So I'm going to read just another page or 2. So this is Taylor's story. Taylor was excited. It was an unplanned pregnancy, but she was quite excited to parent. She was excited to have the baby. She's going to figure out how to go to school once the baby was born. She moved across the country to be closer to her own mom so that she could figure this out. Taylor knew that parenting would be a lot of work, especially without a steady income or a trustworthy boyfriend. When she Googled help for single moms in her home state, she was flooded with ads for adoption agencies. The first 3 or 4 search results were all for agencies, and I was like, that's something I haven't really considered. Let me just look. Curious, she clicked on the ads for more details and was soon mesmerized by the compelling profiles of waiting families in their suburban homes with stay-at-home moms, extended families, graduate degrees, and disposable income. Things were getting harder and harder for Taylor. She was desperately sick during her pregnancy. She was so desperately sick during her pregnancy that she had to quit her job. She sold her car to buy a plane ticket to move across the country to live with her mom, but then she'd spiral into anxiety about how her only available car was her stepfather's pickup truck with no space for an infant's car seat. I remember spending all night one night throwing up, wishing that my pregnancy would just be over, which I thought made me a terrible mom, and obsessing over the fact that I still had no way to even get a baby home from the hospital. Even though she still wished to parent, the idea of adoption became a lifeline for her. Taylor wasn't the only mother I spoke with who was bombarded with similar ads while actually searching for parenting support. Adoption agencies pay for traffic to their sites, as do prospective adoptive parents who create their own websites to showcase their family profiles. They typically target terms that do not include adoption. A search of a keyword in digital advertising research platform revealed that adoption agencies routinely buy Google ads for practical search queries like assistance for pregnant mothers in Nevada, or housing programs pregnant DC, or seemingly generic searches like college pregnancy stories or even just prenatal care. Many terms were related to unintended pregnancies but carried no sense of crisis. Unplanned pregnancy baby announcement, or how to tell your husband you're pregnant when you weren't trying. Then there were 3 agencies who bought ads on the desperate search string, I'm scared, I'm pregnant, and I'm 15. Pregnant women searching any number of queries will have ads promoting adoption pop up. And if they click on any of these, the ads will follow them to Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and other social media sites. These ads are paid for by would-be parents who have been instructed by dozens of how-to articles in the art of search engine optimization and online advertising. These prospective parents are in turn sold a set of paid services in website design, Google and Facebook ad campaigns, and profile development, including photography packages, and in one case, an extra fee to have an advising birth mother provide feedback on their profile in advance of it going up online. The cumulative cost of these services and campaigns are in the thousands of dollars, when most relinquishing mothers report that they would be parenting if they had that much additional money in their own bank account. And importantly, the costly bombardment of advertising is not always legal. Many states regulate the extent to which advertising for adoption is allowed and by whom, but such restrictions are often very difficult to enforce. One industry exploration found that unlicensed for-profit adoption brokers frequently outspent regulated agencies on a massive scale, leaving pregnant people highly exposed to the least scrupulous players. Women who seek abortions can face similar exposure. In 2016, I was inadvertently included on this email that was also being sent to adoption agency employees across the country. Copley advertising can mobile geofence Planned Parenthood locations and other abortion clinics. We will geofence Planned Parenthood locations and other abortion clinics, tag all the smartphones in the clinic, drill down a demographic, women 18 to 24, place an ad in a mobile app, you have options. The ad will then direct traffic to your landing page. When women leave the clinic, they will continue to see your ad for 30 days. We just finished a large campaign with Bethany Christian Services. If you are not the appropriate person to contact, please forward the information to the correct person. Thank you. I was not the appropriate person to contact. The banner ads Copley offered would appear in the phones of anyone in or near healthcare facilities that provided abortions. Copley Advertising, a Boston-based firm, soon settled with then Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey, and without admitting liability, agreed to stop geofencing clinics solely in that state, but only after they ran a campaign targeting 140 abortion clinics and methadone treatment centers for Bethany Christian Services, one of the largest adoption agencies in the country. This legal intervention in Massachusetts doesn't mean that geofencing has gone away. In 2022, Choose Life Marketing, a digital marketing firm that works primarily with anti-abortion crisis pregnancy centers and adoption agencies, was still promoting not just physical geofencing of clinics, but virtual geofencing. Virtual geofencing allows adoption agencies to advertise directly to people who have visited specific URLs, including abortion clinic sites or places to order abortion pills online. The ability of these ads to appear in people's most innocuous searches or at their most vulnerable moments makes them especially invasive. It's difficult to overstate how captivated many mothers are by the adoptive family profiles they find online. Okay, I'll stop there. So I think that this sort of speaks to this I don't want to say gray area because I don't think it is morally gray. Like I think that this is not a practice that we should be allowing or accommodating. But it's not the same level of coercion that we have seen in other cases, right? Where people are going to be charged with fraud if they decide to parent, or told, oh, if you decide to parent, you need to pay back the cost of your housing or any support that you received during your pregnancy, right? Those things still happen. But there are also these practices that fall short of that, that even if they're in a morally unambiguous space, are in a legally ambiguous space that happen in a lot of ways. And so I think that it's important to understand that this is what happens when adoption occurs within a market-based system, right? We have very, very high demand for babies and very, very few number of babies that are available for adoption. And so agencies and brokers and attorneys are highly motivated to find and make children and babies available for adoption. And the way that they do that is by targeting pregnant people. So I spend a good amount of the book trying to explore that and flesh that out and what it actually looks like for people who have to some degree chosen to interact with it, or people who haven't, how adoption agencies find them. So I think I'll stop there because I'm sure folks have a lot of questions. I haven't been paying attention to the chat because then I always find it distracting. So I don't know if there are already questions waiting for me.
I have questions.
Yeah.
I actually remember the very first person you brought up, Haley, and her infatuation, referring to the adoptive parents or adoptive mother as like a sister. And I couldn't find which page it was on where you checked back in with her 10 years later, asking about that relationship. Do you have that page number by chance?
I can find it. Let me find it. I'll find it in the PDF. That'll be faster. But oops.
I just remembered that story standing out to me like, oh, wow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, I also have to acknowledge that these are like asymmetrical relationships that I have with my participants, right? Because they spoke with me 10 years ago and they don't remember what they told me. Right. And I have a transcript and a recording of our conversations. And I think that that's important because they don't always recognize the ways that the adoption has changed for them over time. Right. I found it. Hold on, let me minimize the screen so I can pull this over. So readers will recall Haley, who spoke about her son's adoptive mom as like a sister who she felt cared about her independent of the adoption. Years later, when I spoke with Haley, who had been 19 years old at the time of the adoption, there were no mentions of sisterhood or daily phone calls. She hadn't seen her son or his adoptive parents in about 2 years, and she texted with Rachel every few months. She knew which state they lived in, but not exactly where. I don't ever disinitiate just because I don't want to bother them, Haley said, but it's a nice little surprise whenever Elijah sends me a text message. He recently sent me a picture of his birthday cake. So much.
I liked how you described it as a honeymoon period, and I think so many of us have heard those really enthusiastic stories from parents who are just a few years out and are maybe still in similar positions as they were when they made the decision, and they're still very optimistic. And I think, as you said, they haven't been disappointed yet.
Yeah. I think there is definitely, and like whenever you speak broadly, like you're not reflecting every experience, but almost all the mothers I spoke with did go through like an immediate mourning period, right? So the first year and a half, 2 years were really hard, where they were grieving the loss of their child in their lives. And I think that's important. But even if they were sad, they often felt positively about what adoption was going to offer them, their child. And then you kind of have this honeymoon period. People call it different things. Like one mother was like, this is our rainbows and sunshine phase. This is the honeymoon phase. This is the foggy phase, right? To borrow from like the out of the fog language that a lot of adoptees use. And where there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that usually they're still in somewhat similar circumstances to wherever they had been at the time of the adoption. So those reasons feel very present for them still in a lot of ways. But in addition to that, things just haven't gone wrong yet. For some of them they have, right? And those people don't get a honeymoon. But for some of them, they're still feeling really, again, just, I keep saying the word optimistic because I think that's what it is. Like the adoption hasn't actually delivered on their promises yet, but they just keep believing that it will. And then they stop.
Mm.
Right. And Kate, one mother I interviewed, she talked about, around her son's first birthday, like wanting to have a conversation with his adoptive parents just about how they felt things were going, what they thought of their relationship, like what, just like kind of a check-in. And his adoptive parents just being like, why do we need to have that conversation? Right. And I think that is, that was like her moment where she talks about like needing to go back and grieve again. Because it was this hard moment for her where she realized she had a fundamentally different understanding of what their relationship was going to be, what her role in her son's life was going to be moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Another aspect, and by the way, if anyone wants to raise their hand or chime in, I don't want to hog it, but I have questions. I also really appreciated the work you've done, like on the Turnaway study and the time that you spent in the book highlighting how, because I think at least in my circles, it's really common for people to think that, well, adoption is just the alternative to abortion and that these children are unwanted, and so birth parents would have chosen abortion, and so they're just going to choose adoption instead. And highlighting how many are actually choosing between parenting or who were planning to parent, but for whatever reason, they couldn't get past whatever crisis, and then they would choose adoption, and how just the vast difference between abortion and how many women you saw who were turned away, abortion services who just chose to parent.
Well, I mean, most of the mothers I interviewed, like they never considered getting an abortion, most of them. So that it's just a complete myth that this is how people are not, none of the mothers I spoke with were deciding between abortion and adoption at one point in their pregnancy. So even the mothers who had considered or wanted to have an abortion and were not able to access care for whatever reason, they were not choosing between abortion and adoption. It was only after the choice to have an abortion was off the table, had been taken away from them, that adoption sort of became this lifeline for them. That they weren't considering adoption until they couldn't get an abortion. But even when we look at most people who want abortions, who are denied abortion care, over 90% of those women are parenting, right? And if you have any other choice, you don't choose adoption, right? And I put it in quotes because like that's what so many mothers said, like, well, adoption was like my best and only choice. And if it's your only choice, you don't actually have a choice, right? And I think but that's how they need to frame it, to understand. And I will also say, so two of the women whose stories I tell who were denied, they were participants in the Turnaway study, which is a bigger project that I worked on with my colleagues at UCSF, that followed women who were denied abortion care for 5 years. They were both denied access to abortions. They both relinquished, and they both got pregnant again within 2 or 3 years, like in the course of the study. So certainly within the 5 years, but I think it was even sooner than that for both of them. And the one mother who had initially wanted to parent and kind of got pushed by her boyfriend toward abortion care, like she parented that child. She never considered anything else. And the one woman who had really wanted to get an abortion and hadn't been able to, she just had an abortion in her first trimester with her second pregnancy, right? So having done one adoption, like neither of them were ever going to consider that again, right? This wasn't something that they did if they felt that they had any other path. So.
Well, that also reminds me, that ties into sort of the predatory practices. I found it so interesting, things I didn't know. You had mentioned, I don't know, some legislation that was providing funding for non-directive options counseling, I think was what it was. So federal funding, and And so the idea is that this would be, you know, just plain unbiased counseling for, I assume,
Well,
people.
I think that was theoretically, this is for the.
Right, in theory.
Yeah, in theory.
And then he said that in practice, over 6 million of the original 8.6 million in funding went to the National Council for Adoption. That was just shocking to me.
Yeah, and well, to be clear, like the National Council for Adoption wrote that bill, right? Like they wrote it to get funding for themselves.
That's not non-directed.
Yeah. No. Let me see if I can find that page. That was like, I think early 2000, I think it was during the Bush administration. 82. Because everyone, yeah, here. In 2000, Congress passed legislation requiring the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to fund nonprofit organizations to develop an infant adoption awareness training program to train staff members at federally funded health centers in, quote, non-directive options counseling. The bill received bipartisan support, as conservative Congressman Jim DeMint described. I'm not going to read his quote. Democrats liked it too. In theory, this effort seems good and reasonable. Isn't non-directive counseling a good thing? In practice, over 6 million of the original 8.6 million in original funding went to the National Council for Adoption, a nonprofit organization that works to promote adoption, represents the interests of adoption facilitators, and shapes legislation around the practice of adoption, including the bill that funded IAATP itself. The training developed by the NCFA led to the inadequate adoption promoting counseling that many relinquishing mothers experience today. The training materials describe adoption as a good social institution with positive outcomes for birth mothers, birth fathers, birth families, individuals who were adopted, and of course, adoptive families. That's a quote. It provides specific ways for counselors to override the expectant mother's concerns about adoption, including the barrier of regret. The client feels she will regret making an adoption plan for the rest of her life. The barrier of parenting is bliss. The client has unrealistic expectations of what it means to be a parent and is likely ignorant of the huge responsibilities involved and often believes and is being told that she will receive all the help and support she needs to raise a child and meet her life goals. The hypothetical statement, "I could never give my baby away," a suggested response is, adoption can be a courageous and unselfish decision because you are putting the child above yourself. In response to the worry of, what if my baby ends up in a bad home, counselors are encouraged to respond, did you know that many famous and successful people are adopted? Faith Hill and Ray Liotta. Healthcare providers at family planning clinics across the country reacted negatively to the programming. One saying the training gave tips and techniques about how to work against women's resistance. Another noted that counselors were encouraged to identify clients as deluded, not living in the real world, not being practical, participating in self-betrayal, being ignorant, and generally being unable to make good choices unless it's the choice that the counselor would make for the client. The trainings were overtly religious, including opening with a prayer and promoting the adoption into good Christian homes.
We do have Amy. So Amy is Jamie. Amy's sick, so I'm going to read her comment. She wanted to ask if you could speak to the bipartisan nature of adoption support. This is among the most fascinating thing about this issue, how very hard it is for everyone to see what adoption is on both sides.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think like obviously there are a lot of reasons that conservatives embrace adoption, right? They embrace it as this sort of alternative frame to abortion. That's not true. But it also offers a sort of way of upholding like the ideal of this two-parent family that is sort of this regressive idea is what family can and should be. And it also introduces a private solution that means that they don't have to actually create a robust social safety net that supports families, because if you introduce a private industry to solve the problem, you don't need to make a public investment into it. So there's a lot of these sort of conservative, both socially conservative and fiscally conservative ideas about what adoption offers. Again, none of them are actually about like what children need, of course, but there you have it. And then on the other hand, like liberal, progressive, left of center people really like adoption because it creates this idea. It's like common ground, and like the political left loves to find common ground. So they've chosen to make adoption their common ground. But also this idea of like progressive, like chosen family, the idea that you can create families with people that aren't genetically related to you, don't look like you. This idea that transracial adoption is this expression of a post-racial society, what have you. So there are these sort of ways that adoption is turned into something that progressives embrace as well. And I don't think either these conservative or these liberal ideas about what adoption offers, none of them are rooted in, again, what children need, and none of them are rooted in actual autonomy for pregnant people. But they're also just not at all reflective of what we know adoption looks like for those who are living it. And so, there are not a lot of things that get bipartisan agreement in our government today, but the Congressional Adoption Caucus remains the largest bicameral bipartisan caucus in the federal government, right? And I think that there's this idea that adoption is a way of keeping children safe. That for all of these reasons that both sides like it, like, oh, we can agree on this one thing. We love things we can agree on. There aren't many of them left, so we're going to run with this one. There are also a lot of adoptive parents that hold a lot of power in our federal government. Mary Landrieu, who was a Democratic senator from Louisiana, she championed this from the United States Senate for a really long time in a really big way. 3 of our Supreme Court justices are adoptive parents. Many members of Congress, there's one congresswoman here from California who did adopt, and then the mother changed her mind. And so as a member of our state, she was in US Congress for a while, but when she was in our state assembly here in California, she wrote a bill to shorten revocation periods because that was her experience as a prospective adoptive mother, right? Adoptive parents have more certainly financial and economic power, but certainly political power in a lot of ways that creates this type of consensus.
Can I ask, I'm so curious, what has been the reception so far? Because you've really, I think, spoken to, I would assume, people that don't really know much about what you're talking about, what you're revealing here. So I'm curious what the reception has been.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. I've been talking to a lot of people who've I've never thought about that before. I feel completely differently about this, right? Once they hear people's stories, so many people are like, oh, it's just like a paradigm flip for them. They've just never thought about this before. And hey, that's easy, right? My book strongly, me as a researcher, but as a person, strongly believes that access to abortion care is essential part of our public health ecosystem and essential for women's well-being long-term. So the anti-abortion people, they're already gone. They can leave me mean reviews on Amazon. That's fine. This book wasn't for them. It was never for them. Mm-hmm. But I'm trying to talk in the book. I'm trying to talk to people that are values aligned with me, that share a value around reproductive autonomy, that share the value of believing that we should provide a meaningful social safety net to people, that kind of accept these premises, but have never thought about adoption. And the response from those people has been really powerful and important. And I think it is doing that job. People who are don't believe poor people shouldn't have a right to parent. Why are they trying to parent at all? Or adoption might be bad, but you just want to kill all the babies. Those people, I'm not talking to them. Fine, that's fine. If you don't believe any poor people should parent, I've got other news for you about what America looks like right now, that has nothing to do with adoption. So, I think that there are people that I'm not going to reach with this book, but a lot of them I wasn't trying to reach with this book. So
yeah. We have in the comments, I appreciate you, Gretchen. I've been watching your Twitter posts for a couple of years and appreciate you speaking up and speaking out. So many adoptees I know appreciate you and your work. Thank you. I'm also curious, as someone who was, or is outside of adoption, what have been maybe the most surprising takeaways for you in this process? No pressure.
Yeah. I mean, I guess so again, if there are these groups that the book wasn't written for you, we're not coming to this from the same values-based place. So like that's fine. There are what surprises me most is that like people who still don't get it, right? Do come like, or people who are like you chose these stories in service of like a political agenda. And I'm like, I didn't start this way. I didn't know much about adoption when I started this project, right? This is where the data took me. This is where my conversations with these mothers came. I came to this critical place. It's not like I was like, oh, like, burn it all down. I'm going to go find stories that reflect that. And I think what's important is that that wasn't even clear when I did my first round of data collection. Like
Right.
if you read, like when you read some of my analyses that I published after it says like some of these mothers feel okay about this, right? Like we don't know. And it wasn't until after the 2020 data that I saw almost universally how poorly it was serving people that I was like, that's when it became really radicalizing from my perspective, because I think I still wanted to believe that the system wasn't as, I mean, I'm at the place where I just believe that, like, as long as children are commodified, there's not an ethical way to do this. And so, nothing else matters. That's the premise. Anything that derives from that is going to be flawed. Isn't strong enough of a word, but it's the one that's coming up right now. So, that's a little tangential to your question, but yeah.
No, that's great. That's so interesting. And Kelly in the comments says, do you foresee the book potentially being turned into a film documentary? Oh, that could even be picked up by one of the major streaming services.
Kelly, if you know anyone, I'm actually here in Los Angeles today. And tomorrow, and someone mentioned the documentary, Lisa Elaine Scott. I don't know if Lisa is on, she's an adoptee. She's making a documentary, and I'm going to be filming with her tomorrow. So I'm excited about that while I'm here in Los Angeles. And I know many folks live, but I mean, as a qualitative researcher, like I believe in the power of like narrative stories, like long form narrative stories. I included a lot of first person accounts like throughout the book. That was important to me, that the voices of these mothers that I spoke with were in there in their own words. My agent would love it if someone wants to come pick it up, but I don't know what that will look like. But we'll see. And then Kelly also flagged the Washington Post article. The Washington Post did a great review of the book. It was written by Tatum Hunter, who's actually a tech reporter at the Washington Post, but she's also a first mother.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I was really appreciative of her review.
Yeah. Okay.
Don't make comments. But...
Yes. I want to give some space if anyone wants to ask any questions. I might skip. I have like notes here and things that I love from the book, but oh yeah, Lisa, I'm here looking forward to my session tomorrow and her link to All You Have Is Love. They're asking again, who was the author of the Washington Post article, the name?
Tatum Hunter.
Tatum Hunter. Oh,
and Tatum had, after the Dobbs oral arguments, she wrote an op-ed. That was the first time that she went public with her own experience with adoption. And so when the Washington Post said that they were going to review it, I asked if she would review it. She did.
That's awesome. Okay. Also, I forgot to announce we had a book giveaway. And so I used a little number generator, and our person is Danielle Holcomb. Is that right? Wait, I know that name. That's not your name. Okay, great. Right, let's see. Yay. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Anyone want to speak up? Yeah, Danny.
Yeah, so thank you, Gretchen, for being here. I haven't read your book yet, but I look forward to it and hopefully can get it requested in my library. I just wanted to say, and I don't think you said anything against this, but there's a lot of talk about open adoption and how it generally isn't kept open, but even when it is, it still just sucks. So I like when you were sharing about Haley, I was like, well, I was Haley until the 10-year mark, because I was still thinking they were family and I was family, you know, but it inevitably happens, I think, that we become disillusioned as first mothers, even if we had the fairy tale. And I did, and I'm so sorry for the mothers who think I'm lucky and long for the contact I had. I'm grateful for the contact I had, obviously, but it doesn't mean that it still isn't all loss all the time. And you know, and the family, the status of family, like we were like friends, family for 17 years, and then I left the faith that we had previously shared, and that was it. All of a sudden I wasn't family anymore. So you just never know what the thing might be. And luckily, once your kid's an adult, we can figure it out ourselves. But I don't think they can be the family we want to believe in that fairy tale because of the power imbalance, because of the unnatural situation. Like, it's unnatural. And how didn't I know it? I shouldn't say we, because I know I wasn't forced as much as many others were, but how didn't I know how unnatural it was? It's just shocking to me that the industry has been so successful with the propaganda, you know, that as mothers, we believe it.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, whenever, you know, sometimes I'll hear from like adopted people or birth mothers who are like, I'm thrilled, like, this was the best choice, this, you know, like, and I like, part of me is like, well, you know, it's not my job to like help you understand your adoption differently. Like, as a researcher, that's not what I'm here. But also I'm sort of like, well, like, I kind of hope it does work. Like, I continually like I believe that the system is flawed, but like, if individual people can find a way to be satisfied, like, I would never wish that the pain that I have heard from the mothers that I interviewed, I don't care if it's just a coping mechanism. If it's a successful coping mechanism, like, protect yourself, right? And I think that that's where a lot of mothers are when I first speak with them. So, yeah.
I have a few more comments in the chat. One, how can we help support your work?
You can buy the book. That would be hugely helpful. If for those, you know, I'm really proud of the audiobook too, for people who prefer to read that way. That's really helpful. Things like sales drive more attention too. If you can't afford the book, well, if you can't afford the book, like, let me know, like, especially if you're an adoptee or a first mother, like, I want to make, like, these are your stories. I want you to have them. So if I can send you a copy of the book, let me know, but also is helpful for those who can buy the book to buy the book. And also leave reviews on Goodreads or Amazon or Storygraph or wherever you are. There are a couple of those reviews out there, like I said, just from like people who don't get it, we're never going to get it, who probably actually haven't even read the book, that it would be nice if people who do share this understanding, like, I'm not, you know, leave an honest review if you think there's something I missed. Like, I'm not saying like go heap undeserved praise, but you know, for all those people out there that are coming from a really fundamentally different viewpoint, it's nice to have some reviews that balance that out.
Well, that ties into one of the comments too. I would love to hear if the first moms in the book have read the book and have feedback.
Yeah, so I offered them all copies. I sent them all copies. I've gotten some really nice notes from a few of them, some nice emails. I'm going to meet with one of my participants for coffee right after I get off this call. They sent me a really nice email after they had a chance to read it. I've probably only heard from maybe 8 or 10 or so. But you always hear the positive stuff first. So we'll see if folks.
Well, there's a lot of praise for your book in the chat, and then someone says you owe them an apology because they lost a night's sleep because they couldn't put the book down. So, someone else said, I'm an adoptee.
Someone also mentioned libraries. Yes, you can request it from your library. You can request that your library buy a copy. If you use Libby or Overdrive, like library sales are really, really helpful too. So.
Yeah. Someone else wants it to be required reading for the adoptive parents who come to them for support. A question, any projections for the future? What do you see changing, shifting? Feels like a lot is moving now, especially probably post-Dobbs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what the Dobbs decision did was kind of give people who had never thought about this like a little bit of a window into like a lot of these conservative roots of what adoption is and what it accomplishes. And so I think people are more receptive to this conversation now. I don't know. People often ask me like specific policy questions. I think that we're like not there yet, right? I don't want people to be making policy with their current beliefs about adoption. I think that we need to have this cultural moment where people start listening to people who are impacted the most by the system. I would put adopting people first, right up there, and then birth parents to understand like specifically how this is impacting people who are targeted by this. But yeah, I think that's the first step. That's the first thing that needs to happen is sort of this cultural change. And I'm hopeful for that.
Okay, and thank you so much for your patience. Jenny, please.
Yes. Hi. Gretchen, thank you so much. I just have to say I listened to the book on Audible, so it is already, somebody was asking that in the chat too. But it is on Audible. I took like 10 or 12 pages of notes as I was listening. And I just wanted to say too, I was not part of your book, but I had an open adoption with my daughter. She's 31 years old now. So kind of one of the earliest, I guess, open adoptions. It was extremely open adoption where I was with her like every day for the first 10 days of her life, went to her house. It was very open. It's actually still to this day, one of the most open adoptions that I've heard as I listened to other stories. And I was very, very close with her mom. We had a very respectful relationship for 18 years. And at that point, it has gone down, 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 like super doobie doobie down, down since then, to the point where I'm just going to read this message to you guys really quickly. This happened 2 years ago. I had sent her a message. It was a letter that someone had written, and it was called "To the Birth Mother of Our Unborn Child," because we loved each other, and she definitely was on a pedestal for me. I sent that to her because I wanted her to read that and to remember, like, that's what our relationship was like for so long. And her response was, "I chose not to respond to this for a number of reasons until now. Since I had no context, there was no really way for me to understand what your intent was. I've consulted with our daughter and her husband. I won't say their names. I'll try not to bring some insight. Respectfully, Jenny, you are not my peer. You are no longer a friend, and you are not my family. It is our belief that we could not have been more respectful and generous to you and your family from the start of this relationship. In parentheses, I could tick off a list, but I will choose to refrain. So these text messages are especially unwelcome and offensive. And because I never want to receive another text message like this from you, I've decided to block your number. I wish you and your family well because I do still have very tender feelings for you. We had a long, lovely, and special relationship, but it's taken a path that leaves us at a crossroads. With that last text that you sent me, which was just a sweet article, I don't see that changing. You are still welcome to stay on our property when you visit our daughter." She just said her name, "All the best." And I said, my intent was, what happened? When did you decide that I no longer had value? When did you decide that you were so much better than I am? When did you decide that I what did I ever do in our entire relationship to deserve the disregard that you have shown me in my role as our daughter's birth mother? What happened? Where did I go wrong? In the beginning, with the choice that I made the choice, no one else. I chose you. You did not choose me. I chose you with the agreement that we had an open relationship. I would never, ever, ever, ever have chosen anyone who would not have allowed me to be part of our daughter's life. She is my entire heart. I didn't know that the generosity and the respect that you showed me was anything but genuine, but apparently you want me to thank you for that. I too was generous. I too was respectful, and I have remained that way because that's the person that I am. Saying that I'm not your peer is so self-righteous. We are equals. Neither of us is better nor more valuable. We share a daughter and now a granddaughter. Pretending that away just simply doesn't make it a fact. Do you want great people in their lives? We are my daughter's family also. That's just the truth. And I hope that you find peace. I love you, Jenny.
Oh, that's
And
so...
it kind of went on, but anyway, the point that I'm trying to make, I guess, with reading that to you guys, I just thought it was interesting that I found it so quickly, but is just that even in this very open adoption that we had, it still did the same exact thing. And this was when she was an adult. I mean, luckily my daughter and I have a great relationship, but it affects her every day because she wants both of us, and she wants both of us to love each other like we used to. And it doesn't make sense, you know, to her why this has happened. And anyway, so that's all I'm going to say because I took up a lot of time.
I appreciate you sharing, and that's so tragic. And I feel like it really does go along with some of the other stories that were shared in the book, and I saw some similarities there. That's hard. We've taken up your time, and I love this. We have one more question. How do you perceive this research affecting the trajectory of the feminist movement?
So as I mentioned, I'm here in LA. I'm giving a talk tonight at Ms. Magazine at the Feminist Majority Foundation tonight. And Gloria Steinem blurbed the book. And I know that, you know, second wave feminists did not do a good job of understanding adoption. And they were so attached to this reproductive rights framework that had to understand adoption as a choice, that, and they were all white women, professionals, attorneys, like they had very little understanding of, the circumstances that were actually feeding adoption, both pre-Roe and afterwards. I think that has changed. I think we were in a really different place than we were before. Ms. reviewed the book. I didn't even have to ask. They gave it a really nice, like, full page review, like both a nice review, but also a positive review of the book. They were excited to host me this evening. I'm excited to see some of their supporters out here tonight. I think that, and this reflects like a shift from a reproductive rights framing to a reproductive justice framing. And I talk about this in the book. I know we're way over time, but you all can go if you need to go. But I talk about the example of Norma McCorvey, who was Jane Roe in the Roe v. Wade case. She was pregnant. That was why she was the plaintiff in the Roe v. Wade case. The case took 3 years, right? That daughter was relinquished for adoption, and as were other of Norma's children. And her own, I kind of use like her own personal estrangement from the reproductive rights movement, the way that she didn't fit in as kind of this, metaphor for the way that the reproductive rights movement rejected a lot of birth mothers early on. So, but I think we're in a really different place. I think that reproductive justice, in contrast to reproductive rights, offers a really important framing for understanding adoption. And I hope that, I think feminists are ready for this conversation. They are ready. I've seen them be ready. So.
Well, thank you so much. And I feel like you are contributing to the continuance of this conversation and to that shift in the feminist movement and just our landscape today. So I so appreciate you. I'm so thankful that you joined us today, and so thankful for everyone who came out A round of applause for Gretchen and good luck, and try not to get too exhausted on all of your touring and talking. So
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your support. So thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.